It's probably the hottest border in Africa.
It may be fanciful to call withdrawing South African troops winners in the Angolan conflict. As they pull out from that war-torn country, their negotiations on a peace settlement in Angola and Cuba are far from over. Perhaps with this in mind, convoys...
Travelled this whole world of Ars from Barnsley to Peru. I've had sunstroke in the Arctic and a swim in Timbuktu. I've seen unicorns in Burma and a Yeti in Nepal. And I've danced with 10-foot pygmies in a Montezuma hall. I've met the King of China and the working Yorkshire miner, but I've never met a nice South African.
No, he's never met a nice South African.
After the end of apartheid and during Nelson Mandela's presidency, there was hope in South Africa. Hope that the wealth and prosperity that had been exclusive to white South Africans would soon spread to every South African. But as the 90s came to a close, the USSR collapsed, Germany reunified, and the Yugoslav wars came to an end. And by the beginning of the new millennium, the world was changing, quite radically in some cases. Yet South Africa seemed as if it were stuck in the past. While Mandela's policy of national reconciliation was able to desegregate and unite the South African population, it had done little to alleviate the extreme wealth inequality seen in the country. On top of that, the Mandela government had largely neglected the HIV pandemic and the unrestrained corruption seen in the country. So by 2000, the ANC-led government had a lot of problems to deal with. For starters, almost a quarter of the population was illiterate, HIV prevalence was rising, unemployment was at an all-time high, and the nation's productivity was below the international average by a fair bit. So the ANC government decided that the best way to fix these issues was by spending a lot of money they didn't have. While increasing government spending on healthcare, education, and welfare was yielding positive results, with HIV prevalence lowering and literacy rising, this increased spending had one very big problem. It was making South Africa run a massive deficit. Between January and July of 2000, the ANC government had managed to accrue around $276 billion worth of debt, and with the government losing a little over $9 billion every week, it was estimated that South Africa would be in more than $640 billion worth of debt by the end of the year. But it was fine. As we all know, debt isn't real, so the ANC government decided that all the debt that they were amassing wasn't a now problem, it was a future problem that the future government would have to deal with. So instead of being responsible and maybe, spending a bit less on welfare or administration, the ANC kept up the deficit and didn't really think about it until July of 2001, when the Democratic Alliance started wondering how in the fuck South Africa had accumulated over $880 billion worth of debt in the span of a year. When the DA asked the ANC how they'd racked up so much debt, the ANC told them not to worry about it, which led to the DA and other opposition parties launching an investigation to find out how the fuck the country had gained so much debt. And after about a month, the investigation concluded that the ANC's social programs were responsible for the massive amount of debt. And on top of that, the investigation found that the increase in welfare spending was a useless money drain that wasn't doing anything for the country's population. Furthermore, it was also found that a lot of money that was being spent on welfare and administration was actually being stolen by corrupt government officials, further scrutinizing the ANC and forcing them to hold snap elections to avoid a lot of civil unrest. As the biggest opposition party, the Democratic Alliance won the snap election by a pretty large margin, and as their first act in office, they completely defunded the welfare department. After stopping South Africa's economic death spiral, the DA decided that it was time to turn South Africa into a first world country, so they started implementing what they called the Economic Development Plan. Unlike the ANC, the DA understood that the fundamental problem with South Africa is that it was divided between the rich nation and the poor nation, and as the ANC had proved, you can't just spend a lot of money on welfare and expect your people to become less poor, so the DA took a different approach. They forced their underprivileged population to work in the factories and in the mines. While kickstarting the manufacturing and resource extraction industries wasn't making the population rich per se, it was giving a lot of people well-paying jobs. But more importantly, the switch to a manufacturing-based economy started making South Africa a lot of money. So much money, in fact, that by 2004, South Africa had paid off $200 billion worth of their debt, while their GDP and GDP per capita grew to $730 billion and $15,000 respectively. And after winning the 2004 election, the DA started stage 2 of their economic development plan by building 3 nuclear reactors: the Johannesburg plant, the Cape Town plant, and the Kimberley Research and Development plant. And while South Africa was very transparent with the fact that they were only building these nuclear reactors so they could act as power plants because load shedding fucking sucks, the construction of these reactors made South South Africa's neighbors, namely Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Namibia, very uneasy, and it didn't help that one of the reactors was called the Research and Development Plan. So by 2006, South Africa's northern neighbors had begun military expansion programs under the guise of increasing their ability to fight terrorism in the region. At first, the South Africans paid no mind to their northern neighbors' military buildup because fighting terrorism in the region is a very believable excuse in Africa. Eventually though, the South Africans got wise to the fact that this buildup was against them, mainly because they thought it was a bit suspicious that these military expansion programs coincided with increased military activities at their northern border. But instead of starting their own military expansion program, the South Africans decided that they'd deal with these new threats in their own special way. They were gonna establish puppet governments in their neighbors, and their first target would be Namibia. In 2007, the South Africans would start funding pro-South Africa opposition parties in Namibia. They propped up anti-government militias, and on top of that, they were also paying off the Namibian army. And while a foreign power funding opposition parties and militias in a country usually ends up being nothing more than a mild nuisance, for the Namibian government, which was corrupt as fuck, it ended up being a really big problem. Thanks to South Africa, opposition parties in Namibia were able to gain a majority in parliament where they would repeatedly vote against any proposals made by the government. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the anti-government militias South Africa was propping up and funding were rapidly gaining a foothold in the countryside. And thanks to South African bribes, the Namibian army was largely refusing to engage with these militias. But despite South Africa's efforts to destabilize them, Namibia would be relatively peaceful until 2010, when pro-South Africa opposition parties started staging large anti-government protests, while pro-South Africa militias began attacking government troops. The Namibian government was not well equipped to deal with this crisis, so in a moment of desperation, they did the first thing that came to mind and asked Angola to intervene in the crisis by sending their army. This was apparently the wrong choice because an hour after the Namibian government asked for aid, they were couped by their own army, which then put the pro-South African opposition parties in charge, which then held the referendum to be annexed by South Africa. Unsurprisingly, the people voted yes on this referendum, mainly because Namibia was a shithole and the South Africans had a lot of money they wanted to invest into the Namibian lands. Unfortunately for South Africa and Namibia, Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe didn't like this annexation, so he declared war on South Africa. The war did not go well for Mugabe, partly because the South African military had better training and equipment than his, but mainly because Zimbabwe was in a fucking famine and Mugabe's troops didn't have anything to eat. So by the start of 2011, the remnants of the Zimbabwean army couped Mugabe and surrendered to South Africa. But instead of demanding war reparations or establishing a new government in Zimbabwe, South Africa decided that it would probably be best for everyone if they annexed Zimbabwe, so that's exactly what they did. This annexation deeply upset Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia, but declaring war on South Africa was a no-go because, you know, declaring war on another country is very bad for foreign relations. So instead they decided to form the South African Triple Alliance, or SADA for short, a military alliance that was officially formed in order to bolster its members' ability to fight terrorism by increasing military cooperation. But unofficially, they started shelling the South African border. South Africa was understandably very upset about this attack against their border, but they also didn't want to declare war on SADA because, again, bad for foreign relations. So instead, they decided to launch airstrikes and artillery barrages against SADA positions. This retaliation was met with further escalation when SADA troops started crossing the South African border in order to conduct raids against South African military bases. Now, the South Africans saw these raids as the perfect excuse to expand their nation's territory. So in 2013, they threatened Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland with war if they didn't peacefully accept being annexed into South Africa. Being unable to resist and not really wanting to fight a war against their very powerful neighbor, Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland all accepted being annexed by South Africa. But due to their cooperation, the South African government let these new provinces retain a high degree of autonomy. This triple annexation was apparently the breaking point for SADA, so in early 2015, they invaded the South African provinces of Botswana, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe in order to liberate them. And even though the South Africans managed to repel the invasion thanks to their superior military equipment, they still treated the escalation as an act of war, so they launched their own invasion of the SADA countries. South Africa managed to easily capture southern Zimbabwe and the Zambian provinces of Lusaka and Southern Province. However, they were struggling to make any significant progress in Angola, leading to a stalemate that lasted until 2016, when the UN passed Resolution 2208, demanding an immediate ceasefire, South Africa's withdrawal from the territories they occupied in Zambia and Mozambique, and the beginning of peace talks. While neither side really wanted to stop fighting, they didn't want to get sanctioned by the UN, so they partially complied with the resolution, with both sides refusing to start peace talks, and with South Africa refusing to withdraw from southern Mozambique. Today, South Africa is the world's biggest success story and the most powerful country in Africa. Even though they've been locked in a border war with their northern neighbors for the better part of 12 years, they've still managed to build one of the world's largest economies. And while their aggressive foreign foreign policy has led to them being kicked out of the African Union, they've largely maintained friendly relations with the West, and they also enjoy friendly relations with Australia and Japan. Now, while some may consider South Africa to be a borderline pariah state, they've quickly risen to become one of the world's leading great powers, proving that in unity and diversity, a nation can find strength. Alright, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon like these people up on screen, because you know that's where I post little progress updates and snippets of the video while it's being made for as little as $1 a month. And I think that's it, so yeah, remember to always drink and drive, and I will see you all on the next one, which will hopefully take less time to make than this one. A roll the horror.